Hello, my name is Ariel Silverman, and welcome to my design thinking project. Throughout this video, my project will be presented on whiteboards. I really liked the idea of doing graphics along with the narration of my voice. The topic I chose for this project is how to create a proper lesson plan. Throughout my experience in my practicum, I did not observe my teacher do the kinds of preparations that I've always been taught in the School of Education. That's not to say he didn't do any, but it is to say that I am wanting to explore more on the best ways that I can create a lesson plan for myself. I will go along through each of the 5 steps, including empathizing, defining, ideating, prototyping, and testing, in order to make sure that I have fully developed an idea for how I can best create a lesson plan solution for myself. In order to empathize with my problem, I decided to interview 2 different teachers who I knew would give some good ideas about creating lesson plans. This data would help me further define my own needs in terms of preparation. First, I interviewed a current teacher who works in the Blue Valley District. She is an art teacher for high school students ranging from freshmen to seniors, and this is her 2nd official year of teaching. She emphasized that when she prepared lesson plans, her main concern was the necessary materials for her students. She also noted that her favorite kinds of lessons combined individual work with student collaboration. Finally, she told me about the major importance of including learning goals for her students, both from her school and her own targets to hit. Next, I interviewed a pre-service secondary English teacher who completed her practicum experience in a high school in Kansas City, Kansas. She generally designed what she and I call a roadmap, instead of formal outlines, which basically included an agenda for what steps she was going to take to teach that day. Next, we both agreed that collaboration with fellow teachers, especially veterans, is extremely important, and it can really enhance the learning experience for students as well. Finally, she said that having a backup plan is one of the best things you can possibly do because you never know what kind of day you're going to have with your students. Overall, my main takeaway from these interviews was to prepare for lessons. The worst kind of lesson plan is to have no lesson plan. As I explained earlier, the reason I chose this topic for the design thinking project was due to the fact that I had only observed my practicum teacher create an occasional note card with story names on it to be read that day. While this could be considered a lesson plan, I wanted to dive deeper into the idea of preparation for a class. I also observed that his lessons were fairly repetitive sometimes, so while researching, I tried to find lesson plans which included sections to dictate how I will make the content of my lesson relevant. Using the outline for the definition that we were given in class, here is my defined issue. Ariel needs a way to best create a lesson plan and prepare for her classes, because there are dozens of templates to choose from, and she must find what works best. Before I started researching the different types of lesson plans that are out there, I actually made a list of all the things I thought I would need for it to be effective for my classes. I took this stage as a chance to really think about the different parts of a lesson plan, and from that list, I created this graphic organizer. I know this stage is supposed to include some wild creativity, which is why I included a bubble about having no plan at all. For me, not having any kind of lesson plan would really be a hindrance. I started by putting lesson plan needs in the middle. Next, the very first thing that I wrote were objectives. I know that it's really important to make sure that learning goals are somewhere written out for you and the students to understand. From objectives, I stemmed core standards, district requirements, and KUDs, which are knowledge points, understanding points, and doing points. I learned this KUD model from a class that I had taken with Tina Ellsworth, where she explained about backwards design and making sure that you write every single thing that you think your students are going to know in a type of lesson plan. Next, I have the title bubble, which stems the context of the class, so what kind of students I have in there, as well as the context of the lesson, so things that I would have done before, things I needed to do after. I also have timing, so how do I dictate how much time something is going to take? Is it a block day, or do I do the hours and minutes? I also then have inclusion. So accommodations and modifications I thought were important enough to add as a need. No matter what class context I have, it's really necessary to make sure I have different personalized ways for students to learn. whether that's giving them extra materials or less materials, that would depend on the context of the class, like I said. Finally, the content. I made Make Relevant the biggest part of this lesson plan graphic organizer because I think that each lesson plan that I should research should include a part that has a way to make students engaged. I think that including an anticipatory set and a debrief are really important. I also think that if I don't have those things, my teaching will suffer, and so will the learning of my students. We are now on to the stage where I did the bulk of my research. Before testing each of the 6 sources which gave me my ideas for my own lesson plan, I wanted to see what experts had to say about it. The first person I read from was Jim Burke. A secondary English teacher, Burke has researched and written multiple textbooks for pre-service teachers and how to prepare for classes in general, from relationships to students to specific content lessons. In his book, The English Teacher's Companion, he writes, "It's useful to think of each day as a paragraph in a larger essay about whatever the unit is you are teaching." This quote really spoke to me because as an English teacher, I really appreciate the structure he gives in the way that he designs his lesson plans. Next, we have Lynn Diaz-Rico's book, A Course for Teaching English Language Learners. The reason I wanted to include this in my research is because I know that many of the schools I will be teaching in the future, if not all of them, will have students who are English language learners. I want to make sure that as I am refining the type of lesson that works for me, that I consider the context of my future classes. Diaz-Rico writes, "STEY is an approach used in multilinguistic content classrooms to provide language support to students while they are learning academic subjects. To me, this means that this type of lesson plan that she is describing must include language that has academic meaning as well as content-specific meaning." In this textbook, she gives an example of the types of objectives you must have in a STEY lesson plan. The 5 types of objectives that she includes are setting objectives, preparing modified materials, differentiated instruction, summative assessment of objectives, and reflective pedagogy. While looking for types of guides, I found a couple of research articles which had reached a positive conclusion after using 2 different acronyms for writing a lesson plan. The first comes from John Keller at Florida State University in 2000. He describes the ARCS model for motivating student learning. On page 2 of his article, he describes each of the parts of the ARCS model. First, a lesson must gain a learner's attention. The tactics for this can range from unexpected events, like a loud whistle or an upside-down word in a visual, to mentally stimulating problems that engage a deeper level of curiosity, especially when presented at the beginning of a lesson. This, to me, is another way to say that a lesson must have an initial hook presented to the students. Next, it must have relevance. Even if curiosity is aroused, motivation is lost if the content has no perceived value to the learner. Like I've said earlier, it's very important to me to make sure students understand why the information I'm teaching them will be relevant to them in the future. The third condition that is set must be a sense of confidence for the learners. This is accomplished, Keller says, by helping students establish positive expectancies for success and setting those expectations overtly. Finally, the last part Keller says is a part of the model is that the satisfaction of a learner must be included at the end. For instance, a learner must feel satisfied that they've actually learned something in order for you to move on. Sometimes it can be difficult to track that, but I did like the way that he outlined it in such relatively simple terms. This is a visual of this, if I could be. This is a visual of this in which all of the 4 parts of the ARCS model intersect into learner motivation. The other article I found was written by Kimberly Tanner. She connected the 5E model to the way that people learn. The 5 E's are engagement, exploration, explanation, elaboration, and evaluation. First, Kimberly writes, students must be interested and engaged in what they are learning and find it useful and meaningful. Second, students must be actively involved in the process of teaching and learning, comparing new information to previous ideas, constructing new understandings, and quite simply changing their own minds about how the world works. And third, says Kimberly, students need opportunities to apply what they have learned to new situations and to check the completeness of their understanding, and finally, to evaluate their own learning for themselves. I like how she included the section about evaluation because it is imperative for both students and teachers to reflect on their learning experience. Transitioning to concept-based curriculum and instruction by H. Lynn Erickson and Lois A. Lanning was the first piece of information I ever had and first textbook I read about creating content for a classroom. They write that the importance of lesson planning cannot be overstated. Of course, an excessively detailed lesson plan may take the task too arduous. However, it is inadequate and professionally irresponsible for a teacher to walk into a class thinking, "My lesson plan is in my head." While lesson plans are not foolproof, writing out the key elements of an effective lesson prior to instruction clarifies thinking, serves as a reference for future planning, creates a document for collaboration, and reveals evidence of one's dedication to quality teaching. Additionally, they say that the only real elements of a lesson that you need are examples of the factual content and skills, the guiding questions that are used along the way for your students, the learning experiences and activities that you're going to have in order to teach those pieces of content, and then finally, assessments that are aligned to identified learning targets. To me, this was one of the best pieces that I found doing their research because I thought it was humorous for them to say that the lesson plan is in my head, especially because many new teachers probably think that way. Even the teacher who I most recently worked with often had this idea that if he knew what he was going to do and didn't write it down, it was going to be fine. The last piece of research came from a book by Peter Smagorinsky called Teaching English by Design: How to Create and Carry Out Instructional Units. In the back of his book, he includes the different types of lesson plans that he uses in his class. What I really liked about his lesson plans that he included were that they really only had the minutes and the tasks needed for that day of work. For example, on page 168, he writes, for 3 minutes, it'll be attendance and housekeeping. For 47 minutes, the teacher will ask these questions and it'll be a discussion. Essentially, for me, that's all you really need when writing a day-to-day lesson plan. I think that the kind of plans like this are much more realistic than many of the others that I observed in the research process, especially because even I know when I was going through my practicum experience, it wasn't very realistic time-wise to write out every single thing that I was going to do to the word before I came in and taught the lesson the next day, or however many days before I was preparing. I think that Smagorinsky gives a really good idea about how you don't need to write down every piece like a script, but you do need to have some way to organize your tasks. And another thing that I really like, similar to the previous one that we looked at, is that he also does it by week. I think that organizing Monday through Friday, whether you have a block schedule or regular, 40-minute time period classes, having a week-long plan would be really helpful when you are trying to organize the entire quarter or semester of time. All right, we've made it to the testing stage. This is what I was most excited for while I was going through my design thinking project process, because now it means it's time for me to choose what I think should be most important when making lessons for my own classes. The 5 things that I've chosen to include are objectives for what students need to learn and what I need to teach them, activities for students to do to meet those objectives, the materials we need for those activities to occur, the accommodations and modifications for students who need more help in the classroom, ELL students, students with IEPs, etc. And finally, what I like to call the what now. This will include another section of my lesson plan, which has why this information is important for students, a way that I will be able to evaluate the students after we've completed the lesson, and finally, what we'll be doing on the next day. Ready for my lesson plan? Because I know I am. Okay, so after many hours of research and explanation and making sure that I've done each part of the design thinking project as to the best of my ability, I finally have in my hands the lesson plan that I will probably use in real life. So I wanted to do something at the beginning that would be personalized to me, that I would be able to write on day in and day out, so that I would make sure I had all that I needed to plan, but that I also didn't take time away from my actual teaching by making these plans. So I printed it out. I showed it on the slide before, but I will show it a little bit up close this time now. So we have the objectives, which I adapted a lesson that I actually taught my freshmen. It's from The Birds, which is a short story that Alfred Hitchcock's movie is based off of. I did some activities that they had never seen before. We read it like a campfire story because it was around Halloween and it was really great. But I wish I would have done it in this lesson plan format before, because all I had in preparation for that day was literally bullet pointed list of what I was going to do. So now it's a little bit more organized. I have the objectives, so what I expected my students to learn. I have the actual activities. I would be able to hand this piece of paper to a substitute teacher, and hopefully they would be able to they should be able to understand everything that they would need to do. I also include a materials section. I have the accommodations and modifications for students who I need to make sure are taken care of in my class. And finally, I have my favorite section that I made up, the novel idea, this what now. It includes relevance, so in case students say, why are we doing this? I have this exact section written out right here for them to be told why. I have an evaluation, so the ways that I plan on grading the students or the way I plan on assessing them. And finally, what we're gonna do the next day, because you never know, sometimes the next day section might work out and sometimes, stuff gets shifted, but when I have this, and when I have it completed well, it should work out perfectly.